In the back room of the Grey Hollow Historical Museum rests a brittle, yellowed ledger, its leather cover cracked with age. The pages, brittle to touch, are filled with meticulous handwriting, documenting names, dates, and cryptic marks that no visitor has ever fully understood. Dust motes drift in the air, catching the dim light as though the book itself exhales centuries of secrets. The inked names are not merely records, they are warnings. Each page, when turned, releases a faint, metallic scent that triggers nausea in those who linger too long. It is a visceral reminder of lives measured, scheduled, and stolen. What makes the Blackwell ledger uniquely horrifying is the truth it conceals. Every son in this Appalachian family was expected to drown his own mother, until one refused. This account is drawn from fictionalized historical sources, including Grey Hollow Courier Reports, 1927 to 1933, Appalachian Historical Society records, and preserved household artifacts. All names, dates, and events are entirely dramatized for narrative purposes. No documented case mirrors these events. As you watch, consider the fragile line between obedience and morality, and the choices that define our humanity. If you want to explore more unsettling, immersive stories like this, subscribe and follow along as we uncover the hidden truths buried in forgotten places. The first thing that survives of the Blackwell family is a brittle, yellowed ledger, kept in the attic of the abandoned Blackwell farmhouse on the outskirts of Grey Hollow, Appalachian, Tennessee. Its pages crack when turned, ink smeared with the moisture of decades. Inside are the names of every son born in the family since 1892, each paired with a strange mark in the margin, a mark whose meaning no outsider ever learned. On a cold March morning in 1927, young Jeremiah Blackwell, then 21, carried this ledger with him to the banks of the Little Harlan Creek. The water was icy, sharp against his bare feet, and smelled of mud and decayed leaves. That day, the first ritual was fully observed. Jeremiah's mother, Eleanor Blackwell, aged 4 to 5, stood at the edge, waiting. He stepped forward. Hesitation froze him for a heartbeat. And then, in the silence of the creek, the act was done. The ledger recorded it as fulfilled. The tradition had begun with his grandfather, Silas Blackwell, in 1892, who claimed it would protect the family from misfortune and madness, though his writings hint at a deeper, unspoken fear. Sons were expected to drown their mothers once they reached adulthood, and the family created rules. No outsiders could intervene, no questioning allowed, and no leaving the property after sunset. The ritual was whispered about in Grey Hollow, yet neighbors looked away, afraid of breaking the unwritten laws of propriety. But somewhere between tradition and control, something twisted. A casual reading of Silas's ledger now sends a shiver down the spine of historians who stumble across it. Each entry is meticulous, almost loving, yet the underlying horror is undeniable. Archival sources, such as the 1927 Grey Hollow Courier, reference unexplained disappearances in the Blackwell household, while surviving household records from the Appalachian Historical Society note a sudden spike in male heirs and absentee mothers in the late 1920s. No formal investigation ever penetrated the family's secrecy. The ledger sits today under glass in the local historical museum, a silent witness to a system built on obedience, secrecy, and fear. And the question remains, how did a family make horror routine? By 1930, the Blackwell tradition had woven itself into the fabric of Grey Hollow, unnoticed by most but whispered about by a few daring neighbors. The warping of the family psyche was evident in small, overlooked ways: a son who refused to laugh at the dinner table, a daughter who flinched at her father's gaze, and neighbors who nodded politely but never asked questions. The ledger had grown heavier, not in weight, but in implication. Each new mark brought dread, yet no one dared challenge it. In May of that year, Tobias Blackwell, aged 19, followed the ritual with mechanical precision. His mother, Lillian Blackwell, had been diagnosed with a persistent cough in early spring. No doctor's advice mattered. He led her to the creek at dawn. The water, teeming with spring runoff, bit at her legs. Tobias hesitated only briefly, murmuring her name once before complying. A neighbor, Mr. Henry Clanton, watched from the tree line. He did nothing. Good people enabled this. The family's complicity extended beyond the household. Grey Hollow's local constable, in 1931, filed reports of missing matriarchs and unexplained disturbances, yet official records were mysteriously lost. Even the Appalachian Historical Society noted anomalies in census data and death certificates. No formal inquiry succeeded. Witnesses included domestic staff who were sworn to silence through subtle threats, cousins who visited infrequently, and neighbors who feared social ostracism. The complicity was quiet, almost invisible, yet pervasive. The ledger now contained dozens of entries, each documenting obedience. By 1932, the community had internalized a moral discomfort so profound that silence became habitual. The Blackwells themselves rarely spoke openly about the rituals, yet their actions reinforced expectation. Sons trained sons. Daughters learned to avoid. And outsiders, even those who suspected, turned their eyes away. What began as superstition became a system of control. What began as obedience became moral erosion. Each act repeated, each mark in the ledger, whispered a single truth. This family had normalized horror, and no one, not friend, not neighbor, not law, would intervene. Margaret Blackwell, aged 32, disappeared in July 1929. She had a penchant for wildflowers and collected pressed daisies, keeping them in a small tin box beside her bed. On the morning of her death, she hummed softly while arranging the blooms, unaware that her son, Samuel Blackwell, 17, had already prepared the creek. The water swallowed her carefully, silently, while the daisies floated briefly on the surface. The ledger entry reads, Margaret fulfilled. Creek accepts. Local folklore, recorded in the Grey Hollow Courier, July 1929, vaguely mentions a lady lost to the water, but no name was given. Clara Blackwell, 28 in 1931, kept a small journal where she drew scenes of the Appalachian Hills. She had a laugh that could carry across the valley, though seldom heard in the Blackwell home after the rituals began. On a rainy September afternoon, her son, Elias Blackwell, aged 18, led her to the swollen creek. Witnesses, though unnamed, reported seeing a figure vanish beneath a gray, churning surface. The ledger notes, Clara complete. Hills mourn. A fragment of her journal survives in the Appalachian Historical Society archives, pages smudged with rain and tears. Finally, Beatrice Blackwell, 25, vanished in February 1932. Known for her skill with embroidery, she often stitched tiny symbols into her linens, patterns of hope, of life beyond the household. Her son, Josiah Blackwell, 20, followed ritual instructions precisely. He hesitated only a moment, whispering, "I'm sorry," before letting her go into the freezing current. The ledger states, Beatrice observed. Duty done. An official note in the Grey Hollow Parish records describes her disappearance with sterile detachment, female resident missing. No foul play suspected. They were not legends. They were daughters. Their laughter, their art, their small, human habits, gone, catalogued only in ink and memory. The ledger and surviving fragments serve as mute witnesses, a cruel testament to ritualized obedience. Every name, every age, every date marked not just a compliance but a stolen life. The Blackwell tradition had begun to demand more than loyalty. It demanded the surrender of humanity itself. The creek was frozen in January 1933, its surface glassy and unyielding, yet the Blackwell ritual demanded compliance. Amelia Blackwell, aged 19, stood on the bank, shoulders squared, heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear her older brothers whispering in the trees behind her, rehearsing the ritual, preparing to force her to follow the ledger's instructions. But something inside her recoiled, a sensation unfamiliar and terrifying. Fear. And yet, defiance. Amelia had grown up immersed in the ledger's dictates, memorizing the names, dates, and rituals as though they were scripture. She had seen her cousins vanish. She had pressed her ears to the walls, listening to muffled cries. And now, as her mother, Evelyn Blackwell, aged 43, looked at her with a trust born of decades, Amelia felt a visceral shift. This act, this ritual, would end here. She would not go quietly. Her brothers, Tobias and Josiah, waited with expressions of rigid expectation. The creek whispered beneath its icy surface. Amelia's hands trembled, but she made no move forward. Instead, she stepped back, shaking her head. "I can't," she said, voice barely audible but unmistakably firm. The ledger trembled in her mind, pages flapping like a bird desperate to escape. The family system demanded obedience, yet Amelia found a crack in its foundation, a human flaw that could be exploited. She understood that resistance was dangerous, that the Blackwells had never tolerated hesitation. Yet, for the first time, she felt a sliver of clarity. Survival might be possible, and with it, the chance to break the cycle. Foreshadowing her eventual escape, her defiance rippled outward, unnoticed by the community but searing through the household. Small gestures, a hand held a moment too long, eyes averted, a pause where obedience was expected, became the first sparks of rebellion. Amelia would not obey. She would not drown her mother. And in that refusal, the ledger recorded nothing. But the story had changed. Amelia vanished on a mist-laden morning in February 1933. The creek lay still, glassy beneath a pale winter sun, and the ledger remained on the shelf, untouched for the first time in decades. Her absence was immediately noticed. Tobias and Josiah searched the surrounding woods, calling her name until their voices hoarse. Neighbors reported seeing a lone figure moving across the hills, vanishing into the fog, according to a local witness statement filed in the Gray Hollow Courier archives, February 14, 1933. Rumors swirled. Some claimed she had drowned in a hidden bend of the creek, others whispered of a secret cabin beyond the ridge where she might have taken refuge. The Blackwell family, rigid as ever, could only speculate. Their mother, Evelyn, stared at the door for hours each day, clutching a faded photograph of Amelia at age 12, her smile untouched by fear. Weeks passed. The ledger grew dusty, the ink fading, as if waiting for Amelia's return to decide its next chapter. And then, on a rainy March evening, she appeared. Mud streaked her coat, hair tangled, eyes bright with unspoken stories. She did not speak at first, only stood at the edge of the farmhouse, assessing, watching, calculating. Josiah, rigid and trembling, finally broke the silence. Where have you been?" His voice betrayed a mix of fear and anger. Amelia's reply was quiet but unwavering, alive. The confrontation was brief but loaded. Tobias demanded compliance, but she held the ledger in her hands for the first time, flipping through pages, leaving some blank. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, torn between relief and the horror of what had been expected. Small words, small movements, became acts of rebellion. Her refusal was physical, psychological, symbolic. In the days that followed, Amelia walked the property boundaries, testing the limits of freedom. The family system, once unshakable, now wavered. Every glance she gave, every decision she made, was a subtle assertion. The tradition could be broken, and someone could survive. The ledger, once the final arbiter, waited silently. Its authority was challenged, and the Blackwells, for the first time, felt the uncertainty that their rituals had never allowed. By the spring of 1933, Amelia was no longer fully part of the Blackwell household. The family treated her presence like a fragile, unspoken threat. Meals were eaten in silence, doors remained shut. Tobias and Josiah moved with heightened caution, aware that any attempt to enforce the ledger's demands might provoke open defiance. The once rigid system began to crumble from within, its rules bending under the weight of rebellion. Amelia found refuge in a small cabin atop Shadow Ridge, 2 miles from the creek. She gathered supplies in secret, blankets, canned goods, fragments of her mother's preserved letters, and began to document her own ledger, one that recorded no rituals, only survival. She painted the hills, wrote poems, and listened to the wind in the pines. For the first time, she had agency. Back in the household, the consequences of her refusal were immediate. Evelyn Blackwell suffered a nervous collapse, documented in a fictional note from Dr. Harlan Vickers, local physician, April 1933. Patient exhibit signs of acute stress and tremors, attributed to familial discord. Tobias and Josiah, increasingly paranoid, began fighting openly, each accusing the other of weakness. The creek, once a site of ritual certainty, became a place of dread and hesitation, its waters reflecting uncertainty instead of obedience. Neighboring families whispered of the Blackwells' unraveling. Unattended livestock, abandoned chores, and letters left uncollected suggested a household in disarray. Even the Appalachian Historical Society's records note irregularities in household census reporting, citing possible domestic strife in June 1933. Amelia did not return. Her exile was absolute. She would occasionally observe from the ridge, noting subtle shifts in the household's routines, aware that the system she had defied was fraying. The ledger, once a symbol of obedience, no longer dictated reality. The Blackwell family continued their traditions in fragments, but without total control, the machinery of horror faltered. Silence, once their ally, now amplified the tension. The ledger no longer had the final say. Amelia's survival proved that the system could be resisted, and that some of its threads were irrevocably broken. Amelia settled in the quiet valley of Pine Hollow, nearly 50 miles east of Gray Hollow. The ridge cabin she claimed in 1933 became a home, a sanctuary where the wind carried only the sound of rustling leaves, not the distant whispers of a ledger. Here, she built a life untouched by the weight of ritualized horror. She cultivated a garden, painted landscapes of Appalachian hills, and recorded her memories in journals, carefully noting dates, events, and reflections. Unlike the ledger of her family, hers held no obligation, only survival, observation, and moral reckoning. By 1942, Amelia had adopted a small boy, Caleb, who had lost his parents to illness. She taught him the values she had learned through defiance, questioning authority, cherishing life, and resisting unjust traditions. "You must choose your actions, Caleb," she said one autumn morning, handing him a small notebook. "The world may demand obedience, but that does not mean you must comply." Her words, simple yet powerful, became the foundation of a new household. Local residents of Pine Hollow occasionally spoke of the woman with fiery eyes and a quiet presence. Some regarded her as eccentric, others as wise. The valley offered no ledger, no ritual, no coercion. Yet the shadow of her past remained, a reminder that history can linger even when broken. Amelia often returned in thought to Gray Hollow, imagining her family's fractured system, the creek, and the ledger. She hoped the next generation would break free completely, that Caleb might live without fear of inherited ritual. And sometimes, just sometimes, she imagined her brothers reflecting on her choices, realizing the cost of obedience and the possibility of resistance. In her journals, Amelia wrote, "We are not defined by the rules imposed upon us. We are defined by the choices we dare to make. Life is fragile, but it is ours. And I choose it." Here, the cycle teeters. The future is unwritten. And hope, once fragile, begins to take root. By 1945, the Blackwell system had unraveled entirely. The ledger, once meticulously maintained, sat neglected on a splintered shelf in the empty farmhouse of Gray Hollow. Pages warped and ink faded, its authority meaningless. The family, fractured and mistrustful, no longer followed its dictates. Tobias had left the county, Josiah moved to an industrial town, and Evelyn, frail and quiet, spent her final years wandering the hills, murmuring names she had once feared. The ritual that demanded mothers' deaths had become a memory, fragile yet undeniable. Artifacts remain. The ledger itself, displayed under glass at the Appalachian Historical Museum, a collection of Margaret Blackwell's pressed daisies, preserved in a tin box, fragments of Clara's rain-smeared journal, and the embroidered linens of Beatrice, carefully stored in Pine Hollow with Amelia's own journals. Each item bears witness, silent yet eloquent, honoring lives stolen and choices enforced. Amelia, now in her early 30s, maintained her refuge in Pine Hollow. Her journals and paintings chronicled survival, resistance, and moral reclamation. She occasionally wrote letters to the local archive, ensuring the story was remembered not as legend, but as tragedy tempered with hope. Her adopted son, Caleb, learned of the ledger only through these lessons: how humans can both harm and resist, how obedience can be corrupted, and how courage can break cycles. The victims were not forgotten. Margaret, Clara, and Beatrice, once catalogued only in ink and fear, found acknowledgement in words, artifacts, and memory. Their lives, though stolen, became testimony to humanity's persistence. And in the hills of Pine Hollow, the wind carries a quiet redemption. A daughter survived, a system ended, a new life flourished. The ledger waits, powerless. The creek flows, indifferent. And Amelia whispers to the hills, "Life is ours to choose." Final line, devastating but hopeful horror once inherited ended, and in its place, survival, choice, and quiet hope remained.